Rebecca's ultimate revenge. How she exposed Zied in court and forced him to pay $20,000 from prison. Rebecca Parrott and Zied Hakimi became one of the most recognizable couples in the 90-Day Fiancé universe because their relationship was never simple. From the beginning, their story was filled with uncertainty, cultural differences, family pressure, financial questions, and moments that left viewers wondering whether their relationship could really survive the enormous challenges surrounding it. But now, imagine a completely different chapter in their story. One involving a courtroom, shocking revelations, financial demands, and a claim that Rebecca finally decided she had enough. The headline sounds explosive. Rebecca's ultimate revenge, Zied exposed in court, and a demand for $20,000 connected to a prison situation. However, before accepting every dramatic detail as fact, it is important to separate reality from speculation. There is no verified public evidence establishing that Rebecca successfully forced Zied to pay $20,000 from prison. What makes this storyline compelling is the fictionalized or speculative scenario surrounding what could happen if their relationship reached a breaking point and financial disputes became part of a legal battle. And that is where this story begins. For years, fans watched Rebecca and Zied navigate a relationship that seemed to exist between love and uncertainty. Rebecca was determined to make the relationship work despite the obstacles. Zied, meanwhile, was trying to build a future in America while adapting to a completely different environment. Their relationship attracted attention partly because of their age difference, but also because Rebecca had already experienced complicated relationships before meeting Zied. She was not entering this relationship without emotional history. That history mattered. Rebecca had learned that love alone does not always guarantee stability. Trust, communication, financial responsibility, and honesty can become just as important as romantic feelings. When she met Zied, she appeared willing to take another chance. The relationship developed quickly, and viewers saw Rebecca make significant emotional and practical commitments. She defended Zied, supported him, and repeatedly tried to convince people around her that their connection was genuine. But relationships under public scrutiny can become difficult. Every disagreement becomes a discussion. Every financial decision becomes a question. Every suspicious moment becomes a rumor. And when reality television is involved, even ordinary relationship problems can become larger than life. That is why the idea of Rebecca eventually confronting Zied in court became such a powerful hypothetical storyline. What would happen if the person you trusted became the person you believed had betrayed you? What would happen if money became part of the conflict? And what if years of frustration suddenly came out during a legal proceeding? Those are the questions behind this dramatic story. Rebecca has always been portrayed as someone who does not easily give up on the people she loves. But there is another side to that personality. When someone reaches a breaking point, patience can turn into determination, and determination can lead to confrontation. In this imagined legal battle, Rebecca would not arrive in court simply to argue about a relationship. She would arrive with documentation, messages, financial records, receipts, bank statements, and perhaps most importantly, a timeline. Because when personal relationships become legal disputes, memories can conflict. One person remembers a promise, another remembers something completely different. But documents do not have emotions. They show transactions, they show dates, they show amounts. And that is why financial evidence could become the centerpiece of any dispute involving money. The alleged $20,000 figure immediately makes the story sound dramatic. $20,000 is not a small amount for most people. A dispute over that kind of money could potentially create serious tension between two people who were once deeply connected. But again, the claim that Rebecca actually forced Zied to pay that exact amount from prison should not be presented as established fact without reliable evidence. Instead, the scenario raises a broader question about reality television relationships and what happens when the cameras stop filming. Fans often see the romance, they see the arguments, they see the weddings, they see the family conflicts, but they rarely see every financial conversation happening behind closed doors. That is where misunderstandings can grow. Rebecca and Zied's relationship had already faced questions about money and responsibility throughout their time in the spotlight. For Rebecca, The emotional investment was enormous. She had moved forward with someone from another country, she had defended the relationship publicly, she had dealt with skepticism from people around her, and she had placed her trust in Zied. So, if a serious financial disagreement ever emerged between them, it would not simply be about dollars, it would be about trust. That is what makes the fictional court scenario so emotionally powerful. Imagine Rebecca sitting across from Zied after everything they had experienced together. Instead of discussing their future, they are discussing money. Instead of planning a life together, they are examining financial records. Instead of asking whether they love each other, they are asking who owes what. That kind of transition can be devastating. And for someone like Rebecca, the hardest part might not even be the money. It could be realizing that the person she once defended had become someone she no longer trusted. The courtroom would therefore become more than a legal setting. It would become a place where years of emotional tension could finally surface. Every accusation would carry history. Every document would carry memories. Every statement could reopen an old wound. And if Rebecca truly believed she had been financially wronged, she might feel that pursuing accountability was the only way to finally close that chapter. This is where the headline's idea of ultimate revenge becomes interesting. Revenge and accountability are not necessarily the same thing. Revenge is about making someone suffer. Accountability is about demanding that someone answer for their actions. If Rebecca were ever involved in a genuine financial dispute with Zied, the healthiest interpretation would not be that she was trying to destroy him. It would be that she wanted the truth established and any legitimate financial obligation resolved. That distinction matters, because sensational reality TV headlines often turn complicated personal disputes into simple stories of winners and losers. But real relationships are rarely that simple. There can be love and disappointment at the same time. There can be good memories and serious disagreements. There can be genuine affection mixed with financial conflict, and there can be two people who once believed they would spend their lives together, eventually finding themselves on opposite sides of a dispute. That possibility is what makes Rebecca and Zied's story so fascinating to viewers. Their relationship was never just about romance. It represented a much larger question. Can two people from dramatically different backgrounds build a stable future when their relationship is constantly being tested? At different points, fans had reasons to believe the couple could succeed. They also had reasons to question whether the relationship would last. Rebecca continued to stand by Zied despite criticism. She appeared determined to prove that their relationship was real. And Zied appeared committed to creating a future with Rebecca. But relationships evolve. People change, circumstances change, financial situations change. And sometimes the promises made at the beginning of a relationship do not survive the realities that come later. That is why the alleged courtroom confrontation creates such a dramatic turning point in this hypothetical narrative. Rebecca would no longer be asking people to believe her. She would be presenting evidence. She would no longer be trying to convince skeptics that her relationship was genuine. She would be trying to establish what actually happened, and that is a very different position. The alleged $20,000 dispute would become the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. But there is another important element in the headline: prison. The suggestion that Zied would somehow be paying money from prison adds another layer of drama, but there is no verified basis to state that this happened. Without credible documentation, such a claim should be treated as a rumor, fictional scenario, or sensationalized storyline rather than confirmed news. Still, imagining the consequences of such a situation helps illustrate how dramatically a relationship can change when legal problems enter the picture. If one partner is dealing with incarceration, financial obligations can become even more complicated. Communication becomes difficult. Access to accounts may change. Legal representation may become necessary. And family members may suddenly become involved in disputes that previously belonged only to the couple. For Rebecca, that could create a completely different kind of pressure. Instead of dealing with a relationship disagreement privately, she could potentially find herself answering questions from lawyers, family members, and the public. And once a dispute becomes public, controlling the narrative becomes almost impossible. Every social media post can be interpreted. Every old interview can be revisited. Every photograph can suddenly be examined for clues. That is the strange reality of being part of a popular reality television franchise. The audience remembers. Fans remember what was said years earlier. They remember promises. They remember arguments. They remember suspicious moments. And when a new controversy appears, those old moments can suddenly look completely different. That is why the idea of Rebecca exposing Zied carries so much weight. To expose someone means revealing information that changes the way people understand them. But in a real legal case, evidence must meet a much higher standard than online speculation. A dramatic accusation is not proof. A social media post is not automatically evidence. And a viral headline does not establish that something happened. The most important question would always be, what can actually be verified? If Rebecca had documentation supporting a legitimate financial claim, the documentation would matter far more than rumors circulating online. If Zied had evidence contradicting the claim, that would matter too. A courtroom is not supposed to decide based on which person has the more dramatic story. It is supposed to examine evidence and apply the law. And that is precisely why the imagined confrontation between Rebecca and Zied is so compelling. It takes their relationship out of the world of television drama and places it into a setting where emotional arguments alone are not enough. Rebecca would have to prove her case. Zied would have the opportunity to respond. And the final outcome would depend on evidence, legal standards, and the actual facts. But before any supposed courtroom victory, there would be one question that could dominate everything. Why did the relationship reach this point? Was it money? Was it trust? Was it communication? Was it pressure from fame? Or was there a deeper problem that viewers never fully understood? Those questions are far more interesting than the headline itself, because behind every dramatic breakup story is usually a long history of smaller moments. One disagreement becomes another. One unanswered question becomes another. One financial concern becomes another. And eventually, something that once seemed manageable becomes impossible to ignore. For Rebecca, reaching that point would mean accepting something painful. Sometimes fighting for a relationship is not the same as protecting yourself. Sometimes staying loyal does not mean ignoring your own boundaries. And sometimes the strongest decision is to demand clarity, even when the truth hurts. That is the emotional foundation of this story. Not revenge, not humiliation, not destroying another person, but the moment when someone decides that uncertainty has lasted long enough. And if a legitimate financial dispute ever existed between Rebecca and Zied, the next chapter would naturally focus on the evidence. What documents would Rebecca have? What financial transactions could be traced? What promises were made? Were those promises written down? Did both sides understand the arrangement in the same way? And most importantly, could the alleged $20,000 actually be proven? Those questions would determine whether the dramatic headline was based on reality or simply internet speculation. Because when it comes to reality television, the most shocking story is not always the most accurate story. Sometimes the truth is more complicated, sometimes the truth is less dramatic, and sometimes the real story is hidden somewhere between what viewers were shown and what happened after the camera stopped rolling. Rebecca and Zied's relationship has already given fans plenty to discuss, but the idea of a courtroom confrontation takes that discussion to another level. If Rebecca ever stood before a judge and presented evidence against someone she once loved, it would represent an enormous emotional transformation. She would no longer be the hopeful woman trying to build a future. She would be someone determined to protect herself and establish the truth. And that transformation is exactly where the next chapter begins. Because if Rebecca truly believed she had been financially wronged, the question would not simply be whether Zied owed money. The bigger question would be what happened to the trust between them. And once trust disappears, even $20,000 can become a symbol of something much bigger. It can represent promises that were broken, expectations that were never fulfilled, and years of emotional investment that suddenly feel impossible to recover. That is why this alleged courtroom storyline has captured so much attention. It combines everything that makes reality television compelling: romance, betrayal, money, legal conflict, and the possibility of a dramatic reckoning. But the facts must remain separate from the speculation. There is no verified evidence here establishing that Rebecca exposed Zied in court or forced him to pay $20,000 from prison. What can be explored is the hypothetical scenario and the larger relationship dynamics that make such a headline believable to audiences familiar with their story. And as the story moves forward, the biggest question becomes even more intriguing. If Rebecca really had evidence, what would it reveal? Would it prove that Zied had broken promises? Would it show that money had been mishandled? Or would the courtroom reveal that the entire story had been misunderstood from the beginning? Those are the questions that could change everything. And in the next part, we will go deeper into the alleged financial dispute, the evidence that could potentially become important, the emotional fallout between Rebecca and Zied, and why a $20,000 claim could become the most controversial chapter of their entire story. Rebecca's ultimate revenge, how she exposed Zied in court and forced him to pay $20,000 from prison. Part 2? The deeper we go into the alleged conflict between Rebecca Parrott and Zied Hakimi, the more complicated the story becomes. What initially sounds like a simple argument over money could actually represent something much larger. Years of emotional investment, questions about trust, financial responsibility, and the difficult reality of what happens when a relationship that once seemed permanent begins to fall apart. But there is one point that must remain clear. There is no verified public evidence establishing that Rebecca actually exposed Zied in court, forced him to pay $20,000, or collected that amount while he was in prison. Those claims should not be treated as confirmed facts without credible documentation. Instead, this part explores the dramatic scenarios surrounding the headline and the kinds of issues that could arise if a couple with a complicated public history ever became involved in a serious financial dispute. And if there were ever a courtroom battle between Rebecca and Zied, money would probably be only one part of the story. Trust would be the bigger issue. When a relationship ends badly, people often focus on the final argument. They forget everything that happened before it. But major relationship conflicts rarely appear overnight. They usually develop slowly. A missed promise, a disagreement about money, a secret that was never fully explained, a conversation that ended without resolution, then another disagreement, then another. Eventually, the couple can reach a point where even a small issue becomes emotionally enormous because it represents every unresolved problem that came before it. That is what makes the hypothetical $20,000 dispute so significant. $20,000 would not simply be a number. For Rebecca, it could represent everything she believed she had invested in the relationship. For Zied, it could represent a completely different interpretation of their financial responsibilities, and when two people remember the same relationship differently, a legal dispute can become extremely complicated. Imagine that Rebecca believes she provided financial assistance with a clear understanding that the money would eventually be returned. Zied, on the other hand, might believe the money was given as support during their relationship and was never intended to become a formal debt. Those two interpretations are completely different, and that is why documentation becomes so important. Was there a written agreement? Were there messages discussing repayment? Were transfers labeled as loans? Were there witnesses? Did either person acknowledge owing money? Those questions could become more important than emotional accusations, because a courtroom cannot simply decide based on who sounds more convincing. Evidence matters. This is where Rebecca's alleged exposure becomes a powerful part of the narrative. If she had documentation, she would not need to rely entirely on her words. She could potentially show records that explain what happened. Bank transactions could establish whether money changed hands. Messages could potentially provide context. Receipts could demonstrate expenses. And written agreements, if they existed, could be especially significant. But even then, financial records do not automatically prove that someone owes money. The surrounding circumstances matter. The purpose of the payment matters. The agreement between the people matters. And the applicable law matters. That is why sensational online stories can be misleading. A headline can say someone was forced to pay, but the actual legal process may involve negotiations, settlements, disputed claims, or decisions that are far more complicated than the headline suggests. For Rebecca, however, the emotional side of the conflict could be just as painful. Think about what it would mean to accuse someone you once loved of failing to honor a financial obligation. This is not a stranger. This is someone with whom you shared memories, someone whose future you once imagined, someone you defended.